Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor David Uttal, who is a professor of education and psychology at Northwestern University. His research focuses on STEM education with a particular emphasis on the role of spatial thinking in STEM outcomes. He directs the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center at Northwestern. Welcome, David.
Welcome. Thank you.
I want to start with one of your older papers entitled Exploring and Enhancing Spatial Thinking, Links to Achievement in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, in which you say, although neglected in traditional education, spatial thinking plays a critical role in achievement in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM fields. And you say we review this relationship and investigate the malleability of spatial thinking. Could you talk a little bit about that? So you're finding some connections between just sort of spatial thinking and training and so on to STEM?
Yes, that's the long-term goal, right? Let me start. You said you were an engineer, right, by training?
I was a long time ago. I left engineering in the 90s, David. So
well, the U.S. faces a big shortage of engineers, as you know, and one of the factors that may limit people's access is the high demand for spatial thinking, for thinking about relations among places. Let's just take the classic example, building a bridge. You have to think about the relations between forces, how the bridge might sway in the wind and things like that, and then compensate for that as you build. And it requires thinking about where things are in space and how they might be in space. And some of the most famous scientific insights have often involved spatial thinking. One good example, classic example, everybody who's taken chemistry knows, is Kekulé dreaming about the snake when he was trying to figure out the shape of the benzene molecule. Allegedly, he had this dream, and it was a spatial insight, and the loop of the thing made him think, "Oh, it's connected." And then he thought about how the hexagon or the DNA molecule. So scientists need to be able to think spatially, and engineers too. And so, as I said in the article, it's not part of traditional education. Everybody says it's important. Very few people teach it. And we're trying to change that. It certainly can be taught as early as preschool. And the malleability is really important because a lot of people think that it's sort of something you're born with and not that much you can do about it. We joke about getting lost all the time and things like that. And we giggle like it's, no big deal. But it is malleable. It does respond to experience and training to quite a substantial degree. So that we had reviewed over 200 research studies that looked at spatial training in a variety of contexts, everything from playing video games to, in one case, dress design and anything that was spatially demanding. And we did find that there was a pretty substantial gain. And so there have now been studies that have actually linked this malleability to some aspects of STEM achievement. I would say that research is still in its formative stage because that's a hard thing to prove that some.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah. So let me ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, so there are two things, right, there. One is, can we measure an aptitude to spatial thinking? In other words, whoever is going into STEM, can we measure whether they have an aptitude to spatial thinking, in which case they might do better in STEM fields? That's one. The other thing is, okay, so you don't measure aptitude at intake. I think what you're arguing here is that it doesn't really matter. You can train them and they would become better in STEM, or is it both?
It's
Yeah.
almost certainly both.
Okay.
And I can address that a little bit empirically. So, on average, mechanical engineers were about 1.25 standard deviations greater than the American average. And the average effect of training was about 0.3 standard deviations.
Right.
We could choose stronger effects than the average. So, although we can't take anybody and give them the spatial aptitude that is characteristic of engineers, we can shift the population over so that people have the aptitude. So we said in the paper that we thought with the basic training that we would have, it could be double the number of people who meet that kind of high standard. Now, I also want to say that although spatial thinking is correlated with being an engineer or STEM, I don't see it as a limiting factor so much. I think people are not necessarily born engineers. Early experiences and what they study in school, I think, matter most.
So you would say, think about spatial thinking sort of a native skill, regardless of the profession that you go into. It appears to have beneficial effects. Uh, we, you said that we don't do that in the U.S. that well. Do we know, some of the leading sort of education countries like Finland or other Scandinavian countries? Do we know whether they do anything along these lines there?
It's an excellent question. Finland, not that I know of formally, but there's a lot of informal spatial play for preschoolers. Singapore, in their mathematics curriculum, I think it's part of it. It's not emphasized as exclusively spatial, but I think there's more of it than here. The it doesn't have to be like a separate module, like let's do spatial today. It's part of everyday thinking, particularly for young children. Many of the games that kids play, like blocks, something as simple as blocks, or moving in space, even hopscotch, whatever, are spatial. And the teacher or the parent can point out, oh, look where you moved, and look at this, and how would it look if you went to the other side? So there are activities that are part of children's lives, but perhaps we don't take advantage of them and see them as educational opportunities so much. And it can be part of regular playful learning.
Right. And so you would say, let's shift the curve to the right.
Yes.
Through is sort of early education in this area, right? And it clearly has some beneficial effects regardless of the professions that you go into. My own experience, it's interesting. My dad is a professor of engineering. He retired a long time ago. And I got into engineering. The Indian education system, for example, I grew up in India. It's very much prescriptive,
Yeah.
as you know. And so it's sort of interesting. I stayed in engineering for a little while, but I didn't really like engineering that much. And so so I wondered, again, going back to this aptitude question, which is if you have some sort of systematic education in place, it might reveal your aptitude as you get closer to picking a profession, perhaps.
Uh, yeah, that perspective on things is, um, let's just say, less popular than it used to be. Um, the it's called ableism, that we focus on abilities and often miss the skills that people that we might label in some way as not having skills. So I'm reluctant
Yeah.
to, but I'm not naive. I think, yes, by the time someone's starting to go into a career, I do definitely believe some people are better at some things than other things. But um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that intrigued me, David, and I don't know if I understand this correctly, there is little bit of a negative correlation between spatial abilities and verbal abilities. Is that true or not?
Um, not that I know of.
Okay.
Yeah, the it's the first split in the hierarchy of intelligence, but generally speaking,
Yeah.
so spatial and verbal would be the least correlated, but not negatively. I don't know
Okay.
of a negative correlation.
So least correlated, meaning if you're good in spatial thinking, you are not necessarily good in verbal and vice
Right,
versa, even though intelligence is a broad, sort of broad category
right.
and measurement. Okay.
Yeah, the most
Okay.
popular theory of intelligence is sort of hierarchically organized so that there get more and more sub factors. And so spatial and verbal are among the least correlated. They're the first split. But nevertheless, there is some
Yeah.
basic correlation. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, this might be, sort of putting people in boxes, but is it generally true from an, kind of output perspective that if you look at STEM, really good STEM students, they are slightly less in terms of verbal capabilities, in terms of speaking to people and literature and things like that, or we don't find that at all?
Well, back as far as the 60s and 70s, there were some studies that saw it as, at least amongst boys, the most extreme talented were particularly talented in math or spatial and not as talented in verbal.
Yeah.
But those are really extreme examples. If you look at a
Okay.
Northwestern engineering or chemistry professor, I'm actually
Yeah.
amazed at how highly verbal they are too. So they can do
Right.
everything I can do and then a whole lot more. So
Mathematics and verbal capabilities are, I believe, are highly correlated in the brain, whereas you said the spatial capabilities are sort of the first decision point
yeah,
in terms of that hierarchy, right?
yes. So mathematics is not one ability. It
Yeah.
involves, like there's a lot of verbal in mathematics as well. So mathematics is kind of a higher order skill that combines several different underlying abilities.
Hmm.
But you're right, spatial ability and verbal ability do seem fairly separable. Um, some people can use either strategy. We're doing a study. I've been involved in a study right now that's looking at with fMRI, brain imaging,
Yeah.
the consequences of taking a class, the geospatial semester. A friend of mine invented that is designed to enhance spatial thinking and make people approach problems spatially or to realize the possibility of doing so. And we actually are finding that it may be changing their approach to doing some tasks that weren't specifically trained, like
Yeah.
syllogisms. If
Hmm.
A is equals B and B equals C, does A have to equal C or not? And you have to verify that sentence. Is a classic psychological task.
Yeah.
And there's been debates about how do people do this? Do they form a mental map of the different relations, or they do it through a set of logical prepositions?
Hmm.
They don't necessarily. So the answer to that appears to be both, but there are preferences for one way or the other, and that with spatial training, it might sort of shift people
mm,
to. And it's interesting that some of the brain changes involve uh, sort of decrease in activation. So it becomes these students sort of more quickly and immediately recruit spatial areas to solve the problem. So
mm,
this less sort of higher order, like, how am I going to do this? And so that's, an interesting effect. It does show malleability and the
mm,
involvement of training.
mm, mm. Yeah, I want to jump into a recent paper that you have, situating space using a discipline-focused lens to examine spatial thinking skills.
Yes,
And so here you're looking at specific professions like medicine and geology and things like that, right?
yes.
So
Yeah.
what do you find there? Yeah.
Okay. So, yes, I do believe there's a core spatial ability, but the way this gets fleshed out in practice is really going to vary from profession to profession. So, for one of my favorite example is geologists.
Yeah.
When we study spatial cognition, and since the 60s, perhaps the most commonly used task involves a mental rotation where you have to, for example, look at one block and then imagine whether the other block could be rotated into position, or are they mirror images. So you could, for example, turn your left hand in the same plane and you'll never match up with your right hand. That's why we have so many mismatched gloves, because
Right.
they have to be handed. So
Right.
the um, but geologists, through the collaboration of many people with the natural sciences, um, other colleagues found that geologists, for example, have to think about things like shearing and
Mm,
non-rigid transformations where things bend and don't necessarily rotate as a whole. And
mm,
as an engineer, when forces are applied, it's not always so simple as just a shift or rotation. And rock layers break differently, and so um, the geologists have revealed that that spatial thinking in context matters. And
mm.
I'll never forget looking at an X-ray with my dentist, and and I'm saying, okay, how much is this going to hurt and how much is it going to cost? And I'm looking at the thing, and I'm making inferences, and he says, you can't do that. This is a two-dimensional image, and you have
Mm,
a three-dimensional tooth, so you're making inferences that really aren't justified. And I was like, you're right. And so his expertise is constraining, looking
mm.
how he looks at it. A really interesting story in surgery that's happened past 25 years or so is the switch from almost all surgeries were open to a big reliance on laparoscopic surgery,
Yeah.
whenever it's possible, and that took a lot of retraining. Um, Certainly before the Da Vinci robot, it was basically a
Mhm.
two-dimensional image on a screen, and
Mm,
surgeons were very used to seeing things in three dimension. And so they had to sort of relearn and reestimate. And then the Da Vinci robot came along and simulated three dimensions for them,
mm,
allowed them to see in three dimensions, and actually better probably than they could with the naked eye. But
mm.
that's an example of changes in practice that happen as a result in changes in technology. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting, So um, you get a lot of expertise by experience in a profession, but let me make a hypothesis, and you can correct me if it's not right. But the number of configurations that you're likely to encounter is limited, I would argue. And so it is, within a profession. It's not kind of broad spatial thinking, but sort of expertise constrained spatial thinking, is it or not?
yeah, I think that's an excellent analysis. And in fact, I think expertise is in part in many fields knowing what not to attend to. Because, if you look at a chessboard, you, as a novice, you may be overwhelmed with the number of possibilities, but with
Yeah.
expertise come an understanding of patterns of attack and defense. And that um, allows you not to have to consider every
Mm,
possibility. And I would also argue that's like the history of artificial intelligence. Okay, um, in the mid 90s, I think IBM got a computer that could beat the Grandmaster. But the fact that it took about 40 years of effort shows, people were pretty good. And then a lot of the reason machines can win now is just the sheer number of calculations. This is exaggeration, but maybe they can check every option.
Right.
And humans can't. And so the difference was in part eliminating possibilities. Focus is a simultaneously knowing what to attend to and knowing what to ignore. And I think that we are tuning our senses and expertise. And
Yeah.
I'm really interested in spatial expertise. Yes.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So the fMRI project that you're doing, one of the things that I'm thinking about now is, so you take somebody going into a profession for the first time, you can see what the brain, how the brain activity is, and that person over time, if you do sort of a longitudinal study, I suspect over time that person will reduce, sort of the spatial understanding into heuristics, and potentially, when that person becomes a real expert, there is potentially no need for spatial thinking
Oh,
because everything is sort of reduced to some
that
a
is
finite set of
exactly,
heuristics, right?
that's
Yeah.
exactly what I've written. I don't know if I sent you that paper, but exactly. And
Okay.
and so and this is one of our theories of why organic chemistry is so hard for the novice. I'm fond of saying organic chemistry is the greatest source of psychology majors because people think, they're going to be chemists or doctors, and then organic chemistry comes along and they
Mm.
decide, well, maybe I should switch into something that's a little different. And I do think the evidence shows that for the expert chemist, they know a great deal about these molecules and they can recognize them right away.
Mm.
So if I say, is this a rotated or a mirror image? That's like a basic fact to them. That's like knowing their mother's name. And so, something they could recall right away. Whereas a novice student has to go through the laborious process of mental rotation
Yeah.
to compare it. So that's why I think a little bit of training could get people over that hump where at
Mm.
first it is very reliant. This is actually a general finding is that when we're first learning a skill, general ability matters more than as we become more expert. Yeah, expertise is in some ways tuning our abilities to do exactly what we need rather than relying on the most general approach. You're
Right.
absolutely right. That's great.
Yeah. One other area I was thinking, David, is that it's a slightly different. So if you think about financial markets, traders, right? What it's not necessarily spatial, but there is a connection there, which is looking for patterns in the data,
Yep.
right? Uh, and so again, you can see very expert traders over time reducing that to set of heuristics that becomes sort of second nature for them. And I wondered if it's sort of the same process happening there too.
Absolutely. Um, we tend Experts are actually often dismissive of their abilities because they don't realize how much they're doing. Oh, I just
Yeah.
see it, you know. Well, to be able to see it took you 5 to 10 years of intensive practice and knowing what to look for, knowing what not to look for. And in the case, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in some cases, financial patterns you're looking for certain kinds of shapes,
Yeah. Yeah.
shoulders or whatever.
Yeah.
And the same is definitely true in medicine, in chess, and things like where you're looking for patterns and
Right.
organization. Uh, in radiology, it's just there's all kinds of names that are very much about configurations. I have a
Right.
student in education who's working on the Chinese game of Go,
Mhm.
and there, as you know, is only a few years ago we were able to get a computer to beat the best player.
Right.
And part of it is the incredible number of combinations of permutations. And so Go experts do learn patterns um, and give them names like mouse or cut or tiger mouth, I think. I'm not a Go expert, but that is
Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah.
But we're all experts in a way. I would say, like driving, we know instinctively when a situation merits our full attention and when we can relax a little bit. You shouldn't take your eyes off the road, of course, but um, situations and patterns emerge that we instinctively, hit the brake or turn or whatever it might be. So we're all experts in some way. One more example is like early mathematics. This is Phil Kelman's work out at UCLA. Um, Children have to learn to see numbers. For
Mm,
example,
mm.
23.32 is a smaller number than 100.3. But knowing how to parse the decimal he's argued it's an act of visual expertise. So
Mm, mm.
yes, it certainly applies for the highest level experts, but we're all carrying around some expertise. Reading, it takes a good 5 years for children to become competent readers, and it's not that simple. At first we have
Yeah,
to differentiate one letter from another, and there's all kinds of patterns and classic mistakes that people leave. Then we have to learn how they can be combined, how they relate to sounds. But when you are, as most of us are now, expert readers, you can pick up a thing and you don't have to sound it out. You immediately get the
right.
meaning from it without thinking about what you're doing. But we're all experts at some things.
Yeah, so going back to the education aspect of this, David. So yeah, I don't know if this works, but let me know what you think of it. So are you arguing, sort of, let's get the operating system uh, right in the early education process. So that is really getting, spatial capabilities, ability to think spatially, all those skills, but not specialize, but just get the operating system right. And then as you go into a profession, the real skill is to reduce that into applications,
I,
right? So that there almost like there are two skills there. Because let me ask you this: um, in one sense, you could say you could become very spatially aware and become very creative, let's say, and you keep thinking about possibilities only. So one could argue somebody like Einstein, for example. I think he always thought in terms of sort of spatial visualization of things, right? And so that goes in the creative angle. But for a typical profession, there appears to be another skill, which is reducing that into heuristics in a very efficient fashion. Do you see those two differently,
no, I
or the
agree
same?
completely, but with one reservation. Um,
Yeah.
there's a great book by Jerome Groopman called How Doctors Think, and he talks about, yes, they develop heuristics, and those reduce the amount of work tremendously.
Yeah.
But there is a danger in relying on them too much because, like you say, you're not seeing things, and every once in a while you need to see something that's unusual. So yes, at one level, all doctors know basic anatomy, but then at the same time, in any given operation, a surgeon may encounter unusual anatomy, and they have to be prepared to deal with that as well. So, yes, I agree with you that it's mostly true, but I think two
Mm.
things. I think caution and creativity both require the ability to
Right.
go beyond just relying on the heuristic. So, heuristic, like in any heuristic, it does us a lot of good. It reduces cognitive effort. It frees up our attention. That's all great. But doctors can go down the path to a wrong diagnosis pretty quickly if they don't stop and
Mm.
say, how could I be wrong here? And that's
Right.
what differential diagnosis, when they say, okay, I think it's this, but what else could it be? Uh, that's
Right.
the procedure that sort of puts a little bit of a break on the pure use of heuristic. So I agree with you, but I also
Mm.
think um, you have to kind of live in the cognitive moment too. Make sure that that the heuristic should apply.
Yeah, so that'll make sure, David, that some of us will still have jobs after artificial intelligence and
Oh,
robotics take
yeah,
over, because if it is completely reducible, then we can get rid of humans.
right. And that the artificial intelligence really helps us think about what's different and what's similar. So computers are now, orders of magnitude faster than the human brain. So they can do many, many calculations per whatever unit of time than we can do. But we have this tremendously interconnected network that's been, harder to emulate. So uh, artificial intelligence now can learn visual patterns. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But then we have this very fast and rapid catastrophic drop off when little tweaks, like
Right.
changing the letters from the letters are black and the background is white, and you reverse that. Human has
Right.
no problem with it, but the computer may be completely off and have to basically start at ground zero again. And that shows,
Right.
we're higher order thinkers. So yeah, artificial intelligence is changing a lot, but I think humans still have some very special advantages.
Right. Right. And so what were the sort of the highest level conclusions from this paper, David?
The highest from the you mean the situating space or
Yeah, yeah,
okay. The
looking at
highest level
professions and education.
conclusion
Yeah.
is that if there is a general spatial ability, it's going to be sort of fleshed out in this area expertise. And so, yes, we can measure spatial ability, but that alone isn't going to get you to the level of expertise. So we really need more knowledge on how you become expert in these different fields. Um, yeah,
So it's an interplay between domain knowledge and
yeah.
spatial
Wow.
abilities,
Yes, exactly.
right? So it's sort of it's necessary but not sufficient. You need both of those things to become an expert.
Probably. I,
Yes.
I'm actually, there are low spatial STEM experts. So I'm not 100% sure
Hmm.
exactly how much you must
Okay.
have, but it helps.
Right. 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 I want to get into another topic that is that's in a different area. So this is another paper of yours: the development of children's
Oh,
gender
yes,
science stereotypes. A meta-analysis of 5 decades of U.S. draw a scientist
yes.
studies. You'll talk a bit
Yeah,
about
let me
what
let
is
me
the
first
yeah.
credit the first author of that paper was a former graduate student, David Miller, and he just did an incredible job to look at. Um, there's this test that's been around since the early 70s, and it's very simple. You just ask children to draw a scientist. When this was first done in the 70s, uh, some ridiculous number were male. I think well under 1% were female. So almost all
Hmm.
children drew male scientists.
Right.
And, we
Right.
could tell by the length of the hair or whatever, and the clothes that they
Right.
drew and things like that. I mean, not always, but oftentimes. And
Hmm.
then the question we asked is, how are things changing? Have they changed? I mean, to some
Right.
extent, children's emphasis on male scientists might have been because they don't see very many. In the 70s, there
Hmm.
weren't that many female scientists. And fortunately, that's changed to some
Right.
extent. And we wanted to see if those changes are reflected in this task. So just as a
Hmm.
meta-analysis, we didn't ask anybody to draw, but we did analyze dozens of studies of other people who had asked children to draw. And so we could look at
Hmm.
the effects of two variables that are going to sound the same, but they're not. One is how old the children are, and the second is
Yes.
when the measurement's taken, like what decade. So is an 8-year-old in
Hmm.
1990 similar to an 8-year-old now? And
Right.
actually, both things matter. So, yes, definitely the number of female um, scientists that are drawn has gone from nearly zero to about 30%. And that's good.
Hmm.
Interesting. The evidence is a little weaker for this, but I think the signal was there that as children get older, they seem to actually decrease. This is the sad part. So there's a happy part and the sad part. The sad part is they may have actually decreased the number of female scientists that they drew. And we think it's sort of like on the part the child's observing the world, and seeing. But then stereotypes may kick in, and they may become more familiar with the cultural stereotype of the man with the frizzy hair and start drawing that. So
it could also be data that they're using, right? So for instance, and this is not a big enough impact, but it's symptomatic. You look at Nobel
what?
laureates, for instance,
Yeah.
Nobel laureates, right? And you don't find too many females there,
Well,
even now.
this year.
This
Yeah.
year is different, but generally speaking, so the older kids, maybe they are looking to data that is different from what the younger ones are
Right.
using. And when we look up, so to speak, the further up you go in an organization, in a scientific organization, in recognition, that disparity still exists significantly. So that maybe that the data that they're
Yes,
using could be different.
there's lots of explanations, but I think that the strongest signal in that paper is that there are definitely more female scientists, and children's drawings do reflect that, but not quite as much as they should. So there are still stereotypes that people ascribe to, but there's also it is moving in the right direction. And I was very happy to see both chemistry and physics Nobel Prize were for women this year. I know,
Yeah,
all
that is
one year, but
very unusual.
times they are changing.
Yeah. Right. And this meta study is really big, N of 21,000. So it's quite a
That's
large
putting together
data set.
every single child that's drawn in every single study. So yes, it's 21,000, but we didn't test any of them. Meta-analysis is combining studies. By the way, a lot of the polls now for president are basically meta-analysis. Nate Silver is far more complicated than this, but some people are arguing that a meta-analysis is really all you need. Those guys got the 2016 prediction wrong, so we'll see. I like the simplicity of it, but it has to be right. So
yeah. I mean, if you get artificial intelligence doing the voting, I think the results will be very clear. Humans are extremely
both
fickle,
in the voting booth and on the telephone when asked. So I just, in my research methods class, I'm going through just how challenging this is. Why can't we just call people, ask them who they're going to vote for? They go and vote for it, and we can predict it. Well, humans are complicated, and these are very sensitive topics, and some people don't want to reveal, the reluctant voter and these things. So we polling and sampling are just really hard. Social sciences, it seems simple, but it's not. Sampling is really hard to do well.
Yeah, anytime humans are involved, the problem gets much more difficult. That's why I'm a proponent of just using machines when you can.
Machines for recognizing financial. I imagine there's a lot of artificial intelligence in that now too.
Yeah, that's it is interesting. It's sort of related, so I want to get your perspective on this. In the financial markets, we find machines are actually a lot better now than humans, and there are multiple reasons for it. But one of them is that humans are also emotional, and so you can think about this in the medical field as well. So generally people say you don't want a robot doing the surgery, but I think we're going to get technology a lot better as we look forward, and I think empirically we're going to show that the robotic surgery is going to be less likely, likelihood of getting into trouble. But we already see that in the financial markets, David, that machines are a lot better than humans.
Well, there's an interesting question there. Is how much can we predict? I mean, I'm always wondering whether there's actually a signal there that can be picked up and reliably predicted. It's pretty chaotic.
Yeah, it is. The problem here is that it is, you have this thing
Yes,
called emotions, and so you have to, that has a negative effect on the
right.
outcomes, right? And so when you combine capabilities with that emotions baggage, the outcome of a human is actually less compelling compared to a machine. That is, I don't think we are anywhere close to that in scientific professions like medicine, or you looked at geology here. I don't think we are anywhere close to any of those things because emotions don't play that much of a role, I believe, in scientific
Well,
encounters.
I certainly agree with you relative to the average investor. I don't think that people are ever totally devoid of emotion, nor would we want to be. Like our passions for different topics, may have been what motivated people to make discoveries. But I certainly agree with what the general thrust of what you're saying.
Yeah, and so in conclusion, David, so I want to look at sort of the education policy
Yes,
question here. You have shown early education in spatial thinking has beneficial effects regardless of what you do career-wise later. And so what would you suggest from a policy perspective in education?
right. First of all, I would say we have to involve teachers in these decisions because although I can prescribe things, I mean, the expertise of teachers and the involvement of teachers is critically important. But to answer your question,
Yeah.
I would look for educational opportunities in children's everyday play. Can I give you an example from a colleague, Kathy Hirsch
Yeah.
Pasick at Temple University? She has invented these things called learning landscapes where we build spatial games into the everyday environment. So, for example, when you're waiting for a bus, there could be a game where the child is asked to do patterns or something like that, or they try to augment the cityscape with games. So, I think in terms of teacher education for early childhood education, just to recognize the importance of this. And, I don't know if I could point to where this quote came from, but every good kindergarten teacher knows the value of patterning and learning different patterns. And so I don't think we need so much of a radical change as for teachers to know it's already there, but now to make it part of attention and to show children what they're doing and
Right.
help children make connections from one context to another. There certainly are
Mm.
programs that emphasize spatial thinking, and I think it's catching on. The other thing is, as we're educating, there's a big debate about are we going to, for older kids, are we going to stay on this college for all, or are we educating
Mm.
some people for skilled crafts and sort of restore the American um,
The there's like the
exactly.
German
And we've
apprenticeship
pretty much, I
program.
mean, not
Yeah.
exclusively, but we've lost it. The paradox is there's many high-paying jobs that go unfilled because of the lack of labor, prepared labor. So these tasks, these kinds of things, do also require a lot of spatial thinking and experience. So both, in the college track and the apprenticeship trade school track, I think require spatial thinking.
Mhm. You mentioned Singapore before. What do you know the countries that are sort of advanced in this area? What I mean is bringing in spatial thinking
That it's
early
an
into the
excellent
education.
question. The truth of it is, no, I don't know exactly about cultural
Yeah.
variation, and I don't know if we know that. It's a really good. I know about cultural variation in mathematics, and Singapore is always
Yeah.
stressing math and science, but I don't know how spatial is. It's an excellent question, and I think I'm going to try to pursue it. But I'm
Yeah. The other thing I want to ask you, it also has some
yes,
implications for video games, right? So there is a negative baggage associated with video games for a variety of reasons, but it also has
yes,
this
yeah,
positive impact, right?
it's a
Especially,
dual-edged
yeah,
sword. I mean,
yeah. Go ahead.
we so often focus on the extreme. So we have this child who's addicted to video games and never goes outside, and that becomes the example. Well, that doesn't need to be the example if parents can regulate the amount of time, but some of the spatial reasoning that's involved in video games almost certainly seems to help spatial cognition. So, within reason, they can be extremely helpful. In general, media in general can be very helpful. I don't see it as something to be afraid. If you watch the American Academy of Pediatrics history about this, in the early 2000s, I think they recommended that no child under 2 years of age basically have anything to do with any kind of media, and they have sort of gradually opened that a bit. I think things may be changing. If parents go to the pediatrician and the pediatrician tells them that their children shouldn't do these things, of course parents won't do it, but within reason they can be very, very useful. Now, I'm not talking about aggressive, violent video games. We have to choose carefully, but we choose carefully in the books that we read, in the activities that we do. Choosing carefully is just something parents and children have to do together. Finally, I think we're going to find there's been a lot of video game playing during the COVID pandemic. So it's possible we might see some increases in spatial ability after this thing. Maybe that would be one good thing that I don't know. It's speculation, but it's been very hard for kids.
I was going to say, actually, there is an opportunity here, right? Because you have a lot of online stuff happening with COVID. And so from an education perspective at all levels, there might be an opportunity to think about it more creatively.
When COVID first happened, it was kind of like an emergency thing. What can we get online as quickly as we can? But I think even when the virus dies down and we return to somewhat normal life, I think one permanent change that's happened is a greater acceptance of online learning and for young children. So that opens up a lot of opportunities. So again, you have to be careful, as you do with any educational technology. But we are now, I don't think we're going to have as much age separation in online education as we had before. I think younger children will be able to do it. I think we've realized that it's not necessarily terrible and can have some advantages. That being said, I'd like kids to be able to go back to school as soon as possible.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's hope for that. So this has been great, David. Thanks so much for spending time with me, and good luck with this research.
Bye.
Thank you.